I was 26 years old when my stepmother looked me in the eye at my father's funeral and said, "Don't bother coming to the will reading tomorrow, Sarah. You're not mentioned in it." The words hit me like ice water, but what she didn't know was that my father's lawyer had already called me personally that morning with very different news. I should have known something was wrong when Victoria barely looked at me during the entire funeral service. My stepmother of 15 years sat in the front pew wearing an elegant black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap as she accepted condolences from Dad's business associates and old friends. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat 3 rows behind her, feeling like a stranger at my own father's funeral. The morning had started at 5:30 when my phone rang, jolting me awake in my cramped studio apartment in downtown Portland. I'd been dreading this day for weeks, ever since Dad's cancer diagnosis had taken a turn for the worse. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was familiar. It was Mr. Henderson, Dad's longtime attorney. "Sarah, I'm terribly sorry to disturb you so early," he said, his voice carrying the weight of bad news. "Your father passed away peacefully in his sleep last night. Victoria asked me to inform you about the funeral arrangements." The words felt surreal, even though I'd been expecting them. Dad had been battling lung cancer for 8 months, and the last time I'd seen him, he'd looked so frail that I barely recognized the man who used to teach me how to ride a bike in our old driveway. That was 3 weeks ago, when Victoria had cut my visit short, claiming Dad needed his rest. "The service is this afternoon at 2 o'clock at Riverside Memorial Chapel," Mr. Henderson continued. "But Sarah, there's something else. I need you to know that despite what anyone might tell you, you are very much included in your father's will. In fact, there are some significant provisions that concern you directly. I'll be in touch after the service to arrange a proper meeting." His words puzzled me, but grief was already settling over me like a heavy blanket, making it hard to focus on anything beyond the fact that my father was gone. I thanked him and hung up, then sat on the edge of my bed staring at the rain streaking down my window, trying to process that the man who had raised me single-handedly for the first 11 years of my life was no longer in the world. Dad and I had a complicated relationship, especially after he married Victoria when I was 11. Before her, it had been just the two of us against the world. My mother had died in a car accident when I was 3, and I had no memories of her beyond the few photographs Dad kept on the mantelpiece. He used to tell me stories about her, how she loved to garden and could make anyone laugh, how she used to sing me lullabies in Spanish because she'd grown up in a bilingual household. Those early years with Dad were some of my happiest memories. He worked as a successful commercial real estate developer, but he always made time for me. Saturday mornings were for pancakes and cartoons. Sunday afternoons were for hiking in the mountains or visiting museums. He taught me how to throw a baseball, helped me with my math homework, and never missed a single school play or parent-teacher conference. Then Victoria came into our lives like a perfectly polished tornado. She was beautiful in an intimidating way, with platinum blonde hair that never seemed to move, and a wardrobe that belonged in fashion magazines. She was 32 to Dad's 45, and she had a way of making him laugh that I hadn't seen since before Mom died. At first, I was excited about the possibility of having a mother figure. I'd always felt the absence of that maternal presence, especially when I saw my friends with their moms at school events. But Victoria made it clear from the beginning that she wasn't interested in being anyone's mother. She was polite to me in front of Dad, but when he wasn't around, she treated me like an inconvenient piece of furniture that someone had left in her newly redecorated house. She never said anything outright cruel, but there were 1,000 small cuts. Comments about how I was getting too old to need so much of Dad's attention. Suggestions that maybe I should spend more time with friends instead of hanging around the house. Gentle redirections when I tried to join her and Dad for their evening walks or weekend antiquing trips. The house changed after they got married. Victoria redecorated everything, replacing Dad's comfortable lived-in furniture with sleek modern pieces that looked beautiful but felt cold. The family photos that had covered every surface were suddenly confined to one small shelf in the hallway. The cozy reading nook where Dad and I used to spend Sunday afternoons was transformed into a formal sitting room that no one ever actually sat in. More troubling was how Dad started to change. The man who had once been completely present during our time together began checking his phone during our conversations. Our Saturday morning pancake tradition became sporadic, then disappeared entirely when Victoria started planning elaborate weekend getaways for just the two of them. He was still kind to me, still told me he loved me, but I could feel him pulling away, bit by bit. The turning point came during my sophomore year of high school. I had been accepted into an expensive summer art program that I desperately wanted to attend. Dad had always encouraged my drawing and painting, even setting up a small studio for me in the basement. When I showed him the acceptance letter, his face lit up with pride. "This is incredible, sweetheart," he said, pulling me into a hug. "We'll figure out the tuition, don't worry about that." But 2 days later, he sat me down with a different expression entirely. Victoria stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her face carefully neutral. "Sarah honey, I've been thinking about the art program," Dad said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's a lot of money, and Victoria and I have been discussing some financial changes we need to make. Maybe you could try again next summer, when we're in a better position." I looked from him to Victoria, understanding immediately what had happened. She'd convinced him that spending money on my dreams was frivolous, unnecessary. The worst part was that I knew Dad could afford it. His business was thriving, and Victoria had just bought herself a new BMW the month before. "But Dad, you promised," I said, my voice breaking. "You said my art was important." "It is important," he said quickly, reaching for my hand. "This is just about timing." Victoria's grip tightened on his shoulder, and I saw something pass between them, some silent communication that excluded me entirely. That's when I realized that my place in this family had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer Dad's priority, I was no longer the daughter he would move mountains for. I had become the stepdaughter, who needed to understand that there were more important things than her teenage dreams. High school became a series of similar disappointments. School trips that were suddenly too expensive, college visits that were postponed indefinitely, a prom dress that Victoria deemed too costly when she was simultaneously planning a $15,000 kitchen renovation. Dad would always apologize privately, explaining about budgets and priorities, but he never overruled Victoria's decisions. By the time I graduated, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I'd learned to make myself small, to ask for nothing, to expect disappointment. When I told them I wanted to study graphic design at the State University, Victoria was the first to speak. "That's not really a practical career choice, is it?" she said, stirring her coffee with perfect measured motions. "Maybe you should consider something more stable. Business administration, perhaps. Or nursing." Dad nodded along, though I could see something conflicted in his expression. "Victoria has a point, Sarah. The creative fields are very competitive. Maybe you could study graphic design as a minor." I ended up compromising, majoring in marketing with a graphic design minor, funding my education through a combination of student loans, part-time jobs, and the small college fund Dad had started for me before Victoria entered the picture. The fund was much smaller than I'd expected, though Dad never explained why. College was a relief in many ways. Away from the house, I could remember who I used to be before I'd learned to constantly second-guess my worth. I threw myself into my studies and my art, working multiple jobs to stay afloat financially. Dad called occasionally, and we'd have pleasant but surface-level conversations. He never visited my campus, though he was always full of excuses about work and travel. After graduation, I stayed in Portland, finding a job at a small marketing firm that let me use my design skills occasionally. I lived in a tiny apartment and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, but I was proud of my independence. Dad and Victoria had moved to a larger house, in an exclusive neighborhood, and the few times I visited, I felt like I needed an invitation to be there. The distance between Dad and me continued to grow, especially as Victoria began hinting about their plans to travel extensively once Dad retired. There was never any mention of including me in these dreams, never any suggestion that I was part of their long-term vision. I was the child from his previous life, the responsibility he'd discharged by getting me through college. Then, 2 years ago, everything changed when Dad was diagnosed with lung cancer. The disease was aggressive, and the treatment was brutal. Suddenly, the man who had seemed so strong and invincible was reduced to someone who needed help walking to the bathroom. For the first time in years, Victoria seemed genuinely vulnerable, and I thought maybe this crisis would bring us all closer together. I started visiting more frequently, bringing Dad his favorite soup from a restaurant we used to go to when I was little, sitting with him during chemotherapy sessions, when Victoria couldn't handle the hospital environment. During these quiet moments, I caught glimpses of the father I remembered from childhood. He would ask about my work, my art, my dreams. He would apologize for not being more involved in my life recently, though he never directly acknowledged Victoria's role in our distance. "I should have done better by you, Sarah," he said one afternoon, as we sat in the hospital waiting room. His voice was weak from the latest round of treatment, but his eyes held more clarity than I'd seen in years. "I let other priorities take precedence, and that wasn't fair to you." I wanted to tell him everything, all the years of feeling displaced and unwanted in my own family. But he looked so frail, so defeated by the disease ravaging his body, that I couldn't add to his burden. Instead, I squeezed his hand and told him I loved him, which was true despite everything. Victoria's treatment of me during Dad's illness was complicated. In front of the medical staff, she played the role of the grieving wife, who was grateful for her stepdaughter's support. But in private moments, I could feel her resentment building. She seemed to view my presence as an intrusion, a reminder of Dad's life before her. When I offered to help with medical appointments or household tasks, she politely declined. When I suggested modifications to make the house more accessible for Dad's mobility issues, she dismissed my ideas as unnecessary. The worst incident happened about a month before Dad died. I had arranged to spend a weekend helping him organize some of his business papers. It was something he'd been wanting to do, but hadn't had the energy for. When I arrived on Saturday morning, Victoria met me at the door with barely concealed irritation. "He's having a difficult day," she said, blocking the entrance. "The doctor says he needs complete rest, no visitors." I could hear Dad calling my name from somewhere inside the house, asking if I'd arrived yet. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she stepped aside reluctantly. I found Dad in his study, surrounded by boxes of documents, looking more energetic than I'd seen him in weeks. "Sarah, thank goodness you're here," he said, reaching out to hug me. "I've been looking forward to this all week. There's so much I need to tell you, so much I need to make sure you understand." We worked for several hours, with Dad explaining various aspects of his business and pointing out important documents. He seemed almost urgent about it, like he was racing against time to share everything he felt I needed to know. Around noon, Victoria appeared in the doorway, with a tray of sandwiches. "Robert, you're overexerting yourself," she said, her voice carrying an edge I'd learned to recognize. "Sarah, I think it's time for you to go. He needs his medication and a nap." Dad started to protest, but a coughing fit overcame him, leaving him breathless and exhausted. Victoria used the moment to guide me toward the door, her hand firm on my elbow. "I know you mean well," she said, as we reached the front door, "but you don't understand his condition the way I do. These kinds of activities are too stimulating for him." I left reluctantly, but not before Dad called out to me from the study. "Sarah, remember what we talked about. Remember everything I showed you today. It's important." That was the last substantial conversation I had with my father. Victoria began screening my calls and visits more strictly, claiming that Dad's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and that any excitement could be dangerous for his health. When I did see him, it was for brief supervised visits, where Victoria hovered nearby, ready to cut things short, if she deemed the interaction too taxing. The phone call announcing Dad's death hadn't come from Victoria. It had come from Mr. Henderson, Dad's lawyer, which struck me as odd, but not suspicious at the time. Grief has a way of making everything feel surreal and disconnected. It wasn't until Victoria's comment at the funeral that I began to understand why the lawyer had contacted me directly. The funeral service was beautiful in the way that expensive funerals always are.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The chapel was filled with Dad's business associates, golf buddies, and country club friends. Victoria had chosen elegant flower arrangements and hired a string quartet to play classical music. Everything was perfectly orchestrated and completely impersonal, bearing no resemblance to the man who used to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs and taught me to identify bird calls during our weekend hikes. I sat in the back, watching strangers eulogize my father with generic praise about his professional success and community involvement. No one mentioned his sense of humor or his love of old Western movies. No one talked about how he used to read me bedtime stories with different voices for all the characters. The man they were describing sounded impressive but hollow, like a successful stranger who happened to share my father's name. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief throughout the service. Accepting condolences with graceful dignity, she looked the part of the devoted widow perfectly, and I suppose in many ways she was. She had loved Dad in her own way, though it was a love that required erasing most traces of his life before her. After the service, as people mingled in the chapel's reception area, I approached Victoria to offer my condolences and discuss the practical arrangements that follow a death. She was surrounded by her friends from the country club, women who looked at me with the polite but distant expressions reserved for people who don't quite belong. "Victoria, I'm so sorry for your loss," I said, reaching out to touch her arm gently. "If there's anything I can do to help with the arrangements, please let me know." She turned to face me fully, and for a moment I saw something cold and calculating in her expression that made my stomach clench. Then she smiled, the same polite smile she'd been giving me for 15 years. "That's very kind of you, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the women around us. "But everything is well in hand." Robert was very thorough in his planning. One of her friends, a woman with silver hair and expensive jewelry, leaned closer. "Victoria dear, you must be exhausted. All these arrangements, and dealing with Robert's business affairs on top of everything." Victoria nodded gracefully. "It is overwhelming, but Robert made sure I knew exactly what needed to be done. He was always so protective of me, always making sure I would be taken care of." There was something pointed in the way she said it, something that felt like a message directed specifically at me. Before I could respond, she continued. "In fact, Sarah, I should mention that there's really no need for you to come to the will reading tomorrow. Robert's instructions were very specific about who should be present. I know it might seem harsh, but he was quite clear that you're not mentioned in the will. He felt it was better to be direct about these things, rather than create false expectations." The words hit me like a physical blow. The women around Victoria shifted uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed to be witnessing such a personal moment. I felt my face burn with humiliation and confusion. Dad had always told me that he would make sure I was taken care of. That family was the most important thing. Had he really cut me out of his will entirely? "I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure? Maybe there's been some mistake." Victoria's expression softened into something that might have been pity, but felt more like satisfaction. "I'm sorry, dear. I know this must be disappointing. But Robert felt very strongly that people should make their own way in the world. He was proud of how independent you'd become, how you'd built your own life without relying on family money." The implication was clear. According to Victoria, Dad had deliberately excluded me from his will as some kind of character-building exercise. It was a narrative that painted her as the considerate messenger delivering difficult news, while casting me as the grasping stepdaughter who had expected an inheritance she didn't deserve. I excused myself and left the reception, driving home in a fog of hurt and confusion. In my apartment, I pulled out the box of childhood mementos I'd saved over the years. Photos of Dad and me at my high school graduation, birthday cards he'd sent during college, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother. These tangible reminders of our relationship seemed to contradict Victoria's version of events, but grief was making it hard to think clearly. That evening, I called Mr. Henderson's office and left a message asking for clarification about the will reading. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I was sure he could hear the uncertainty and pain in my words. If Victoria was right, if Dad had truly excluded me from his will, then I needed to understand why. Had I disappointed him somehow? Had Victoria convinced him that I didn't deserve to inherit anything from the life we'd built together before she arrived?
Mr. Henderson returned my call within an hour, which surprised me. His voice carried an urgency that I hadn't noticed during our brief conversation that morning. "Sarah, I'm glad you called," he said. "I want to make absolutely certain that you understand what I told you earlier. Regardless of what anyone else has said to you, you are very much included in your father's will. In fact, there are provisions that specifically concern you. The reading is scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at my office. Please don't let anyone convince you not to attend." His emphasis on anyone else made it clear that he'd anticipated Victoria might try to discourage my presence. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by anger. Victoria had lied to me at my father's funeral, had tried to humiliate me in front of her friends, had attempted to exclude me from the will reading based on complete fabrication. That night, I lay awake wondering what other lies Victoria had told over the years. How many times had she claimed to speak for Dad when she was really advancing her own agenda? How many opportunities for connection between Dad and me had she sabotaged with her careful manipulations? The next morning, I dressed carefully for the will reading, choosing a simple black dress that seemed appropriate for the occasion. I arrived at Mr. Henderson's office 15 minutes early, partly out of nervousness and partly because I wanted to observe Victoria's reaction when she saw me there. The law office was located in one of Portland's historic buildings downtown, with dark wood paneling and leather furniture that conveyed decades of professional respectability. The receptionist, a kind older woman, offered me coffee and directed me to a conference room where I could wait. At exactly 10 o'clock, Victoria arrived wearing a navy blue suit and a shocked expression that she couldn't quite conceal when she saw me sitting at the conference table. Behind her was a man I didn't recognize, tall and distinguished with silver hair and an expensive-looking suit. "Sarah," Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought I explained yesterday that your presence wasn't necessary." Before I could respond, Mr. Henderson entered the room, carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that suggested this meeting would be more complicated than a typical will reading. "Good morning, everyone," he said, taking his place at the head of the table. "Victoria, I'd like you to meet Sarah Marchetti, Robert's daughter. Sarah, this is Victoria Marchetti, and I believe you know each other. The gentleman with Victoria is James Crawford, her attorney." The fact that Victoria had brought her own lawyer to the will reading struck me as unusual, but Mr. Henderson didn't seem surprised by the arrangement. He opened the folder and pulled out several documents, arranging them carefully on the table. "Before we begin with the formal reading," Mr. Henderson said, "I want to address some apparent confusion about the contents of Robert's will. Victoria, I understand you told Sarah yesterday that she wasn't mentioned in the will. I need to clarify that this information was incorrect." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained smooth. "I was simply trying to spare Sarah any disappointment. Robert and I discussed his wishes many times, and he was quite clear about his intentions." Mr. Henderson nodded politely, but his expression was skeptical. "I'm sure you had many conversations with Robert about his estate planning. However, the will I'm about to read was executed 6 months ago, and it contains several provisions that I believe will surprise you." He opened the document and began reading in his clear professional voice. The legal language was dense and technical, but the basic outline became clear quickly. Dad had left the house and most of his liquid assets to Victoria, which I had expected. What I hadn't expected was what came next. "To my daughter Sarah Elena Marchetti," Mr. Henderson read, "I leave the entirety of my business interests in Marchetti Commercial Properties, including all current holdings, contracts, and future development rights. I also leave her the contents of safety deposit box number 4737 at First National Bank, along with all documentation contained therein." The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria's face had gone completely white, and her attorney was scribbling notes frantically. I stared at Mr. Henderson, trying to process what I'd just heard. Dad had left me his business, the company that had been his life's work, worth millions of dollars. "There's more," Mr. Henderson continued. "Robert also established a trust fund for Sarah's future children, seeded with $2 million. Additionally, he left her his collection of her mother's personal effects, which have been stored in a separate safety deposit box since Elena's death." Victoria found her voice first. "This is impossible," she said, her careful composure finally cracking. "Robert and I went over his will together just last month. He said he was leaving everything to me except for a small bequest for Sarah, maybe enough for a down payment on a house." Mr. Henderson's expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction. "Mrs. Marchetti, are you certain you're thinking of Robert's current will? Because I have his signature and 2 witnesses on the document I just read, dated 6 months ago. This is definitely his most recent and valid will." Victoria's attorney leaned over to whisper something in her ear, but she shook her head impatiently. "I don't understand how this could have happened. Robert wouldn't have made changes without discussing them with me. We were married for 15 years. I was his wife." "You're absolutely right that you were his wife," Mr. Henderson said calmly. "And as such you're entitled to challenge the will if you believe there were irregularities in its execution. However, I should mention that Robert came to my office alone when he made these changes. He specifically requested that no one else be informed about the new provisions until after his death." I sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Dad. He had secretly revised his will to leave me his business, the thing he had worked his entire adult life to build. Why hadn't he told me? And why had he let Victoria believe she would inherit everything? "Sarah," Mr. Henderson said, turning his attention to me, "your father left a sealed letter to be given to you after the will reading. Would you like me to read it aloud, or would you prefer to read it privately?" I looked around the table at Victoria's shocked face and her attorney's concerned expression. "I'd like to read it privately, if that's possible." Mr. Henderson handed me an envelope, with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. "Take all the time you need. Victoria, Mr. Crawford, if you'd like to discuss the provisions of the will, I'm available to answer questions." I stepped out of the conference room and found a quiet corner of the law office, where I could read Dad's letter without interruption. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope, and I had to take several deep breaths before I could focus on the words. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've just learned about some changes I made to my will. I know this probably comes as a shock, and I wish I could have told you about it in person. But I was afraid that if Victoria knew about my intentions, she would try to prevent me from carrying them out." The letter continued for 3 pages, and with each paragraph, my understanding of the past 15 years shifted dramatically. Dad explained that he had never stopped loving me, or regretting the distance that had grown between us. He wrote about feeling trapped between his love for Victoria and his responsibility to me, about making compromises he later regretted. "I know I failed you in many ways," he wrote. "I let Victoria convince me that stepping back would help you become more independent, but I see now that what she really wanted was to erase you from our life together. I should have been stronger, should have insisted on maintaining our relationship despite her objections." He went on to explain that the business had always been intended for me, that he had started Marchetti Commercial Properties, with the dream of building something he could pass down to his daughter. Victoria had known this, but over the years, she had gradually convinced him to delay making me a formal partner, always citing some reason why it wasn't the right time. The final straw was when she suggested that I sell the business and use the proceeds to fund our retirement travels, Dad wrote. She painted a picture of us spending our golden years visiting Europe and Asia, completely free of business responsibilities. She made it sound romantic and adventurous, but I realized she was asking me to destroy your inheritance to fund her dreams. The letter revealed that Dad had been keeping detailed records of my accomplishments and interests throughout the years. Victoria had been filtering our communication. He knew about my art, my work in marketing, my struggle to build an independent life. He had been proud of me all along, even when I thought he'd lost interest. "I hope you can forgive me for not being the father you deserved," the letter concluded. "I hope the business will give you the security and independence I failed to provide while I was alive. Most importantly, I hope you'll understand that my love for you never wavered, even when my actions suggested otherwise." I sat in that quiet corner of the law office for nearly 20 minutes reading and rereading Dad's words. The grief I'd been carrying since his death was now mixed with relief, vindication, and a deep sadness for all the years we'd lost to Victoria's manipulations. When I returned to the conference room, Victoria and her attorney were deep in heated discussion with Mr. Henderson. They looked up as I entered, and I could see calculation in Victoria's eyes as she tried to gauge my reaction to the letter. "Sarah," she said, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, almost pleading. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Your father was on so much medication toward the end, and the grief of his illness affected his judgment. I'm sure if we work together, we can sort this out in a way that honors his true intentions." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Marchetti, I should point out that Robert came to me 6 months ago, when he was still relatively healthy and lucid. The will was executed well before his condition deteriorated. Additionally, he left specific instructions about implementing these provisions." He pulled out another document from his folder. "Robert arranged for the business transition to begin immediately upon his death. Sarah, if you're willing to accept the inheritance, we can schedule a meeting for next week to begin transferring the necessary documents and accounts." The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. I wasn't just inheriting money or property, I was inheriting Dad's life's work, a thriving business with employees and clients and ongoing projects. It was both an incredible gift and a tremendous responsibility. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at me. "I don't know what kind of manipulation you used on Robert during his illness, but I won't let you steal what rightfully belongs to me." Her mask of polite civility had finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating woman I'd always suspected lurked beneath the surface. But for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't intimidated by her anger. "I didn't steal anything, Victoria," I said quietly. "Dad chose to leave me his business. Maybe if you'd spent less time trying to erase me from his life, you would have understood how important that business was to him." She stared at me for a long moment, then gathered her purse and stalked toward the door. Her attorney followed, apologizing to Mr. Henderson for the disruption and promising to be in touch about their legal options. After they left, Mr. Henderson and I sat in the conference room, discussing the practical aspects of my inheritance. The business was indeed valuable, generating significant annual revenue from commercial real estate developments and property management. There were ongoing projects worth millions of dollars, long-term contracts with major clients, and a staff of 12 employees who had worked with Dad for years. "Your father spoke about you often during our meetings," Mr. Henderson told me as we reviewed the business documents. "He was incredibly proud of your independence and your creative talents. He believed you had the intelligence and integrity to carry on what he'd built." As I drove home that afternoon, my mind was reeling with everything that had happened. In the span of 2 days, I'd gone from being the forgotten stepdaughter to inheriting a multi-million-dollar business. Dad's letter had revealed that Victoria had been orchestrating our estrangement for years, manipulating both of us to serve her own interests. But more than the money or the business, what meant the most was learning that Dad had never stopped loving me. All those years when I'd felt displaced and unwanted, he had been thinking about me, planning for my future, trying to find a way to make things right between us. The tragedy was that we'd run out of time before he could tell me any of this in person. That evening, I called my best friend Maya, who had been my closest confidant since college. She listened in amazement as I recounted the events of the past 2 days, occasionally interrupting with exclamations of disbelief. "So let me get this straight," she said when I'd finished the story. "Your evil stepmother tried to trick you into missing your own father's will reading, where you found out you inherited his entire business empire." When she put it like that, it did sound like something out of a movie. "It's not an empire exactly," I said, though I was still trying to wrap my head around the scope of what Dad had left me. "But yes, essentially that's what happened." "Sarah, this is incredible," Maya said. "I mean, obviously I'm sorry about your dad, but this has to feel like some kind of cosmic justice after everything Victoria put you through." She was right about the justice aspect. For 15 years, Victoria had worked systematically to diminish my place in Dad's life, always with plausible explanations that made her seem reasonable and caring. She had succeeded in convincing both Dad and me that distance was healthy, that I needed to learn independence, that family money would somehow corrupt my character. Now it was clear that her real motivation had been securing her own position as Dad's primary heir. She had seen me as competition for his affection and his assets, and she had played a long, patient game to eliminate that competition. What she hadn't counted on was Dad eventually seeing through her manipulations and taking steps to correct them. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of legal meetings, business consultations, and crash courses in commercial real estate development. I had taken a leave of absence from my marketing job, explaining to my bewildered boss that I'd inherited a business and needed time to figure out what that meant. He looked at me like I'd told him I was moving to Mars, but he agreed to hold my position for a month while I sorted things out. Mr. Henderson introduced me to the key people in Dad's professional circle. There was Margaret Santos, the longtime office manager who had worked with Dad for 12 years and seemed to know every detail of every project. She was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of competence that made complicated things look effortless. When Mr. Henderson brought me to the office for the first time, Margaret took one look at me and smiled. "You have your father's eyes," she said simply. "He talked about you constantly, especially these past few months. He was so proud of what you'd accomplished on your own." The office itself was a revelation. Located in a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, it had exposed brick walls lined with architectural drawings and photos of completed projects. Dad's personal office was exactly what I would have expected, organized but comfortable, with family photos on his desk that included pictures of me from various stages of my life. Victoria had claimed he never displayed photos of me, but here was evidence to the contrary. Margaret walked me through the current projects, explaining Dad's development philosophy and his reputation in the Portland commercial real estate market. Marquette Commercial Properties specialized in adaptive reuse projects, taking old industrial buildings and converting them into mixed-use developments that preserved historical character while meeting modern needs. It was creative, sustainable work that required both business acumen and artistic vision. "Your father always said that buildings have stories," Margaret explained as we looked at renderings for a former textile factory that was being converted into artist studios and retail space. "He believed our job was to help them tell new chapters while honoring their past." I found myself genuinely excited about the work in a way I hadn't expected. My background in marketing and graphic design suddenly felt relevant in ways my old job never had. Understanding how to present projects to potential tenants, how to create compelling visual materials, how to think about branding and community engagement. These were skills I'd been developing without realizing they might someday apply to something like this. But learning about the business was only part of the challenge I was facing. Victoria had not accepted her reduced inheritance gracefully, and her attorney had filed a formal challenge to the will within a week of the reading. They were claiming that Dad had been mentally incompetent when he made the changes, that I had exerted undue influence during his illness, and that the will didn't reflect his true intentions. Mr. Henderson assured me that their case was weak. Dad's medical records showed no evidence of cognitive decline 6 months ago when the will was executed, and the witnesses to the signing were both medical professionals who had specifically attested to his mental clarity. More importantly, Victoria would have to prove that I had somehow manipulated Dad, which would be difficult given how limited my contact with him had been during his final months. Still, the legal challenge was stressful and expensive. Victoria had hired an aggressive attorney who seemed determined to drag the process out as long as possible. They filed motion after motion, requesting extensive documentation about Dad's mental state, our relationship, and the circumstances surrounding the will's execution. Each filing required a response from our legal team, and each response cost money I didn't yet have access to. The irony was that while I'd inherited a valuable business, most of my inheritance was tied up in ongoing projects and property holdings. I couldn't access the liquid assets until the will was probated, which couldn't happen until Victoria's challenge was resolved. Meanwhile, I was burning through my savings paying for legal fees and living expenses while learning to run a company I'd never expected to own. 3 weeks after the will reading, I was working late in Dad's office, trying to understand a complex zoning proposal, when Margaret knocked on the door. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you," she said, her expression unreadable. "Victoria is in the conference room." My stomach clenched. Victoria and I hadn't spoken since the confrontation at Mr. Henderson's office, though her attorney had been communicating plenty through legal filing. I couldn't imagine what she wanted to discuss in person. I found her sitting at the conference table, looking polished and composed as always. She was wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her platinum hair was styled in a perfect bob. But when she looked up at me, I could see strain around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. "Hello, Sarah," she said, gesturing for me to sit across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." I hadn't actually agreed to anything, but I took a seat and waited for her to explain what she wanted. We sat in silence for a moment, and I was surprised to realize that I wasn't intimidated by her presence the way I used to be. Learning about Dad's true feelings, understanding the extent of her manipulations, had fundamentally changed how I saw her. "I want to discuss a resolution to this situation," Victoria said finally. "The legal proceedings are expensive for both of us, and I think we can find a compromise that serves everyone's interests." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of compromise?" Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the persuasive tone I remembered from childhood negotiations about bedtimes and allowances. "I'm prepared to drop the will challenge in exchange for a 50-50 split of the business assets. You keep the operational side, the day-to-day management, but I become a silent partner with rights to half the profits and half the proceeds if you ever sell." The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity. She was essentially asking me to give her half of my inheritance in exchange for her not challenging my right to the other half. It was extortion disguised as compromise. "That's generous of you," I said carefully, but Dad's will was pretty clear about his intentions. He left the business to me, not to us. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "Your father's will was written when he was grieving and not thinking clearly. We both know that's not what he would have wanted if he'd been in his right mind." There it was again, the narrative that Dad had been mentally incompetent, that his decision to leave me the business was somehow evidence of cognitive decline rather than deliberate choice. It was a story that required believing that loving his daughter and wanting to provide for her future was fundamentally irrational. "Actually, I think it's exactly what he wanted," I said. His letter made his reasoning pretty clear. Victoria's carefully controlled mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "That letter proves nothing. Grieving people write all sorts of things they don't mean. Robert was angry with me during his final months because I couldn't handle watching him suffer. He wrote that letter to punish me, not because he actually wanted you to have everything." The interpretation was so self-serving that I almost laughed. According to Victoria, Dad's decision to leave me his life's work was really about her, a petty act of revenge rather than a father's love for his daughter. It was typical of how she'd always seen our relationship, as something that existed primarily to affect her. "Even if that were true," I said, "it wouldn't change the legal reality. The will is valid, and I'm not interested in giving up half my inheritance to make you feel better about it." Victoria stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice rising. "You think you can just walk in here and run Robert's business because you inherited it. You don't know anything about commercial real estate. You don't have the connections or the experience. You're going to destroy everything he built." There was probably some truth to her assessment. I was definitely in over my head, learning on the job while trying to manage complex projects worth millions of dollars. But her assumption that I would inevitably fail felt less like realistic concern and more like wishful thinking. "Maybe I will fail," I admitted. "But if I do, it'll be my failure to make, not yours to prevent." Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her recalculating, trying to find a different angle of attack. When she spoke again, her voice was cold and precise. "You should know that I've been talking to some of Robert's major clients," she said. "People who've worked with him for years, who trusted his judgment. I've been sharing my concerns about the transition, about whether the company can maintain its standards under new leadership." The implication was clear. Victoria was actively trying to sabotage the business by undermining client confidence in my ability to run it. It was a strategy that could be devastatingly effective in an industry built on relationships and reputation. "That seems counterproductive," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you're challenging the will because you want a share of the business, why would you try to destroy its value?" Victoria smiled, and it was the most honest expression I'd seen from her all evening. Because if I can't have what Robert promised me, then I'm going to make sure you can't enjoy what you stole from me. After she left, I sat in the conference room for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Victoria's mask had finally come off completely, revealing the calculating, vindictive person I'd always suspected she was. But knowing her true nature and dealing with the practical consequences of her sabotage were different things entirely. Over the next few days, I started getting calls from nervous clients. They were polite but concerned, asking about the transition, wondering if their projects would continue on schedule, hinting that they might need to reconsider their relationships with Marchetti Commercial Properties. Victoria had been subtle but effective, planting seeds of doubt about my competence without making any overt accusations. Margaret was furious when I told her what was happening. "That woman has some nerve," she said, pacing around the office like a caged tiger. "After everything your father did for her, after all the years he supported her lifestyle, she's trying to destroy his legacy out of spite." But Margaret also had practical suggestions for how to address the situation. She arranged meetings with key clients, so I could introduce myself properly and demonstrate my commitment to maintaining Dad's standards. She connected me with industry contacts who could vouch for my character and potential. Most importantly, she shared stories about Dad's vision for the company that helped me understand not just what we did, but why we did it. One of those stories involved a project Dad had completed 5 years earlier, converting an abandoned department store into affordable housing for seniors. The project had been financially challenging, with slim profit margins and complex regulatory requirements. Victoria had argued against taking it on, claiming it wasn't worth the hassle for such small returns. "But your father didn't see it that way," Margaret explained. "He said the building had been the heart of that neighborhood for 60 years, and it deserved to serve the community again. He spent months working with city planners and community groups to design something that would honor both the building's history and the residents' needs." The finished project was beautiful, with studios and one-bedroom apartments that retained the original terrazzo floors and Art Deco fixtures, while providing modern accessibility features. More importantly, it had sparked a renaissance in the surrounding neighborhood, attracting new businesses and investment while preventing displacement of longtime residents. "That's the legacy your father really cared about," Margaret said. "Not just making money, but making a difference." Victoria never understood that. Stories like these helped me develop a clearer sense of what Dad had been trying to build and what I wanted to continue, but they also highlighted how much I still had to learn. Commercial real estate development involved construction management, zoning law, environmental regulations, financing structures, and community relations. Dad had spent decades mastering these skills, and I was trying to absorb them in a matter of weeks. The learning curve became even steeper when I discovered that Victoria's sabotage efforts were more extensive than I'd initially realized. She had been cultivating relationships with several of Dad's key business partners, suggesting that they might want to reconsider their involvement with Marchetti Commercial Properties under new management. 2 investors pulled out of pending projects, citing concerns about leadership stability. More troubling, I learned that Victoria had been in contact with Dad's bank, raising questions about my qualifications to manage the company's credit lines and development loans. Banking relationships in commercial real estate are crucial, built on years of trust and successful project completion. Victoria's campaign of doubt was threatening to undermine those relationships before I'd had a chance to establish my own credibility. The situation came to a head during a meeting with First National Bank, where Dad had maintained the company's primary business accounts for over a decade. I'd scheduled the meeting to introduce myself to the commercial lending team and discuss upcoming project financing needs. What I hadn't expected was to walk into a room full of skeptical faces who had clearly been primed to doubt my capabilities. The meeting was led by Janet Morrison, a senior vice president who had worked with Dad on numerous deals. She was polite but distant, asking pointed questions about my experience and qualifications that made it clear she viewed me as a risky unknown rather than a valued client successor. "Miss Marchetti," she said, reviewing my resume with obvious concern, "your background is in marketing and graphic design. Commercial real estate development requires very specific expertise in construction, finance, and project management. How do you plan to acquire these skills while simultaneously managing active projects worth tens of millions of dollars?" It was a fair question that I'd been asking myself constantly. But the way she asked it, with barely concealed skepticism, made it clear that she'd already decided I wasn't qualified for the job I'd inherited. "I'm working with experienced consultants, and relying heavily on our existing team," I said, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "Margaret Santos has been with the company for 12 years and knows every aspect of our operations. We also have strong relationships with contractors and architects who've worked with us for years." Janet nodded politely, but her expression remained doubtful. "That's reassuring, but ultimately our lending decisions are based on the experience and track record of the principals. Your father built his reputation over decades of successful projects. We need to understand how you plan to maintain that standard of performance." The subtext was unmistakable. They were considering calling in loans or refusing to extend credit for future projects. Without banking support, Marchetti Commercial Properties couldn't function. Victoria's sabotage campaign was threatening to destroy the business before I'd had a real chance to prove myself. That evening, I called Mr. Henderson to discuss the situation. He listened carefully as I described Victoria's interference and the bank's concerns, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific incidents. "This is unfortunately not uncommon in contested estate situations," he said, when I'd finished. "The challenging party sometimes tries to devalue assets as a negotiating tactic, but Victoria's behavior is particularly egregious because she's actively damaging the business she claims to have a legitimate interest in." He suggested that we could seek a restraining order to prevent Victoria from interfering with business operations while the will challenge was pending. It would require documenting her sabotage efforts and proving that her actions were causing concrete harm to the company. "The problem is that proving interference can be difficult," Mr. Henderson warned. "Victoria is being careful not to make any overt threats or false statements. She's simply sharing her concerns about the transition, which she could argue is legitimate commentary." Meanwhile, I was struggling with the day-to-day realities of running a business I didn't fully understand. Every decision felt momentous and potentially disastrous. When a contractor on one of our renovation projects asked for approval to change suppliers due to delivery delays, I spent hours researching the alternatives before making a choice that Dad probably would have made in 5 minutes. The stress was taking a toll on every aspect of my life. I was sleeping poorly, eating irregularly, and had basically cut off contact with friends who couldn't understand why I'd taken on such an overwhelming responsibility. Maya tried to be supportive, but even she seemed bewildered by my decision to keep the business rather than sell it immediately. "You could cash out and never have to work again," she pointed out during one of our phone conversations. "Why are you putting yourself through this nightmare?" It was a question I'd been asking myself constantly. The rational choice would have been to sell the business to an established developer and invest the proceeds in something safe and predictable. I could have honored Dad's memory without risking financial ruin or nervous breakdown. But every time I seriously considered selling, I remembered Margaret's stories about Dad's vision for the company. I thought about the affordable housing project and the community impact of thoughtful development. I looked at the photos in Dad's office, showing building transformations that preserved history while creating new possibilities. More than that, I realized that learning to run Marchetti Commercial Properties was teaching me things about myself that I'd never discovered in my old job. The creative problem-solving required to navigate zoning challenges reminded me of the art projects I used to love. The community engagement aspects drew on communication skills I'd developed in marketing. Even the financial analysis was starting to make sense as I learned to see patterns and relationships in the data. For the first time in my adult life, I was doing work that felt meaningful rather than just economically necessary. It was terrifying and exhausting, but it was also exhilarating in ways I hadn't expected. The breakthrough came during a city planning meeting for one of our pending projects. We were seeking approval to convert a former warehouse into mixed-use space with ground-floor retail and upper-level offices. The Planning Commission had concerns about parking and traffic impacts, and the neighboring property owners were worried about gentrification effects. I'd prepared extensively for the meeting, studying comparable projects and researching best practices for community-sensitive development. But when it came time to present our proposal, I found myself speaking not just about zoning compliance and financial projections, but about the stories buildings could tell and the communities they could serve. This warehouse has been vacant for 8 years. I told the planning commission, but it was once the heart of this neighborhood's manufacturing economy, employing hundreds of people who lived in the surrounding residential blocks. Our goal isn't just to fill an empty building, but to create space for new kinds of work that can help this community thrive again. I described our plans for affordable commercial space that could support local entrepreneurs, design features that would preserve the building's industrial character while improving energy efficiency, and parking solutions that would minimize impact on residential streets. More importantly, I talked about our commitment to working with community groups throughout the development process to ensure the project served existing residents rather than displacing them. The presentation went better than I'd dared to hope. The planning commissioners asked thoughtful questions that showed they were genuinely considering our proposal, rather than just going through the motions. Several community representatives spoke in support of the project, citing our track record of responsible development and community engagement. After the meeting, an older man approached me with a smile. "You sounded just like your father up there," he said. "Same passion for doing the right thing, same ability to help people see the bigger picture." Robert would have been proud. It was the first time since inheriting the business that I felt like I might actually be capable of carrying on Dad's legacy. The skills were learnable, the relationships were buildable, and the vision was something I could genuinely embrace rather than just imitate. But Victoria wasn't finished with her sabotage campaign. The next week, I received a certified letter from her attorney, demanding access to all company financial records as part of their will challenge. They were claiming that I might be mismanaging the business or hiding assets, and they wanted to conduct a forensic audit of all transactions since Dad's death. The request was legally questionable, but practically disruptive. Responding to it would require hundreds of hours of document preparation and legal review, time and money that the company couldn't afford to waste. It was clearly designed to hamper my ability to run the business effectively while creating additional pressure to settle the will challenge on Victoria's terms. That evening, I was working late in the office, trying to prioritize which documents to gather first, when Margaret knocked on my door. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her expression serious. "Something about Victoria and your father that I probably should have mentioned earlier." She sat down across from my desk, gathering her thoughts carefully before continuing. "About a year ago, your father asked me to help him investigate some discrepancies in his personal financial accounts," she said. Money was disappearing from savings and investment accounts that Victoria had access to, but she claimed not to know anything about the withdrawals. I stared at Margaret, trying to process what she was telling me. "Are you saying Victoria was stealing from Dad?" Margaret nodded grimly. "Not technically stealing, since her name was on the accounts. But she was moving money into accounts that only she controlled, supposedly for household expenses and travel funds. When Robert questioned the amounts, she would get defensive and accuse him of not trusting her." According to Margaret, Dad had become increasingly suspicious about Victoria's financial activities in the months before his death. He'd hired a private investigator to trace the money transfers and discovered that Victoria had moved over $400,000 into accounts that she could access independently. He was planning to confront her about it after his cancer treatment was finished, Margaret said. He didn't want to deal with the stress of a marital crisis while he was fighting for his life, but he also didn't want to leave you vulnerable to her financial manipulation after he was gone. The revelation cast Victoria's will challenge in an entirely new light. She wasn't just fighting for what she felt entitled to inherit, she was trying to prevent discovery of her unauthorized appropriation of Dad's assets. If the will challenge succeeded, and she gained control of the business, she could potentially cover up her earlier financial misconduct. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" I asked. Margaret looked uncomfortable. "Your father made me promise not to mention it unless Victoria tried to challenge the will or interfere with the business transition. He hoped she would accept the will's provisions gracefully and the whole issue could be forgotten. But Victoria had done exactly what Dad had feared she might do. Her challenge to the will and her sabotage of the business were precisely the behaviors he'd been trying to protect against when he changed his estate planning and enlisted Margaret as a witness to Victoria's financial irregularities. "There's more," Margaret said. "Robert kept detailed records of all the unauthorized transfers. Copies of bank statements, communication with the private investigator, even recorded conversations where Victoria admitted to moving the money but claimed it was for legitimate purposes. She pulled a small key from her purse and placed it on my desk. He gave me this and asked me to make sure you got it if anything happened to him. It opens a safety deposit box at Pacific Northwest Bank, one that Victoria doesn't know about. The next morning, I met Mr. Henderson at the bank to open Dad's secret safety deposit box. Inside, we found exactly what Margaret had promised: meticulous documentation of Victoria's financial misconduct, including evidence that she'd been planning to access even more of Dad's assets after his death. There were also personal items I hadn't seen in years: my mother's wedding ring, photographs from my early childhood, and a collection of letters I'd written to Dad from summer camp when I was 10. He'd kept everything, even during the years when Victoria had convinced both of us that distance was healthy for our relationship. But the most significant discovery was a second letter addressed to me, dated just 2 weeks before Dad's death. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then Victoria has probably challenged my will, and Margaret has shared the information about the financial irregularities. I want you to know that I don't blame Victoria entirely for what happened between us. I allowed her to manipulate the situation because I was afraid of conflict and convinced myself that avoiding confrontation was better for everyone." The letter went on to explain Dad's investigation into Victoria's financial activities and his growing realization that she had been systematically isolating him from me while positioning herself to inherit his entire estate.
"I should have been stronger," Dad wrote. "I should have insisted on maintaining our relationship regardless of Victoria's objections. But I want you to know that learning about her deception has helped me understand how much I've lost by letting her come between us. The business was always meant for you, sweetheart. Not because I don't care about Victoria, but because it represents everything I hope to build for my daughter's future." The evidence in the safety deposit box fundamentally changed our legal position. Victoria's unauthorized transfers could be considered theft or fraud depending on how the transactions were structured. More importantly, her financial misconduct undermined any claim that Dad's will revision was irrational or coerced. Mr. Henderson reviewed the documents with obvious satisfaction. "This explains a lot about Robert's state of mind when he came to revise his will," he said. "He wasn't acting out of illness or confusion. He was protecting his assets and his daughter from someone he'd discovered was untrustworthy." We scheduled a meeting with Victoria's attorney to present the new evidence and discuss resolution of the will challenge. I was nervous about the confrontation but also excited about finally having the upper hand in our long-running conflict. The meeting took place in Mr. Henderson's conference room, the same space where Victoria had tried to convince me to give up half my inheritance just a few weeks earlier. This time, however, she entered the room to find copies of bank statements and investigative reports laid out on the table like evidence in a criminal trial. Victoria's attorney, James Crawford, reviewed the documents with a deepening frown. Victoria herself sat rigidly silent, her usual composure replaced by barely controlled panic. "These financial records raise serious questions about Mrs. Marchetti's credibility," Mr. Henderson said calmly. "They also provide clear context for Robert's decision to revise his will. He wasn't acting irrationally, he was protecting his estate from further unauthorized appropriation." Crawford whispered something to Victoria, who shook her head emphatically. Whatever he was suggesting, she wasn't willing to accept it. "My client maintains that these transfers were legitimate household expenses that Robert had approved," Crawford said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own argument. Mr. Henderson smiled politely. "Then I'm sure Mrs. Marchetti won't object to a forensic accounting of her personal finances to verify that claim. We could also subpoena the private investigator Robert hired to document the unauthorized transfers." The threat of full disclosure was more than Victoria could handle. She leaned over to whisper urgently with her attorney, and I could see her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling completely. After several minutes of heated consultation, Crawford cleared his throat. "My client is prepared to withdraw the will challenge in exchange for keeping these financial matters private." It was exactly the outcome Mr. Henderson had predicted. Victoria's misconduct made her legal position untenable, but she still had enough pride to want to avoid public humiliation. "That's acceptable," I said, with one additional condition. "Victoria needs to stop interfering with business operations."
No more conversations with clients or lenders designed to undermine my credibility. Victoria looked like she wanted to object, but Crawford nodded quickly. Agreed, Mrs. Marchetti will have no further involvement with the business. The meeting ended with signatures on settlement documents that officially ended Victoria's challenge to Dad's will. As she gathered her purse to leave, Victoria looked directly at me for the first time since the evidence had been presented. You think you've won, she said quietly, but you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Running that business will destroy you just like it consumed your father. I met her gaze steadily. Maybe it will, I said, but at least it will be my choice to make. After Victoria left, Mr. Henderson and I spent another hour discussing the practical steps for finalizing the estate and transferring full control of the business to me. The legal obstacles were finally cleared, but the real work of proving myself as a developer was just beginning. That evening, I called Margaret to share the news about Victoria's withdrawal of the will challenge. She was delighted but not surprised. Your father was a smart man, she said. He knew exactly what kind of person Victoria was, and he planned accordingly. He wanted to make sure you had everything you needed to succeed, including protection from people who might try to sabotage your efforts. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Dad's final gift to me wasn't just the business itself, but the tools and knowledge I needed to defend it against those who wished me harm. He'd anticipated Victoria's reaction and prepared evidence that would neutralize her attempts at sabotage. For the first time since his death, I felt truly ready to carry on his legacy. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated warehouse that had become our flagship project, watching as the first tenants moved into their new office spaces. The transformation was everything Dad had envisioned and more. What had once been a crumbling industrial building was now a vibrant community hub, with local artists, small tech companies, and a non-profit organization all sharing the beautifully restored space. The Planning Commission approval had been just the beginning. Every day brought new challenges that tested everything I'd learned about construction management, tenant relations, and community engagement. But with each obstacle I overcame, my confidence grew. Margaret had been right when she said the skills were learnable. What I hadn't expected was how much I would love the work itself. The morning of the grand opening celebration, I received an unexpected visitor. Victoria appeared at my office door, looking smaller somehow than I remembered. Her usual perfect styling was still intact, but there was something defeated in her posture that I'd never seen before. I wanted to congratulate you, she said quietly, glancing around the bustling office. And to apologize, I gestured for her to sit, though I remained standing behind my desk. After everything that had happened, I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely. The business is thriving, she continued. I can see that now. Robert would be proud of what you've accomplished. It was the first time she'd acknowledged Dad's satisfaction with my inheritance, and I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to simply accept her apology and move forward. But another part remembered all the years of manipulation and the recent months of sabotage. Why now? I asked. What's changed? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. I've been in therapy, she said finally, trying to understand why I behaved the way I did. My therapist helped me realize that I was terrified of being forgotten, of being replaced in Robert's life the way I felt I'd been replaced in my father's life when he remarried. The revelation surprised me. Victoria had never spoken about her own family background, and I'd always assumed her confidence came from a place of security rather than fear. I'm not excusing what I did, she continued. But I want you to understand that it was never really about the money. It was about feeling like I mattered, like I had a permanent place in someone's life. I sat down finally, processing her words. You always mattered to Dad, I said. He loved you. But loving you didn't mean he had to stop loving me. Victoria nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. I know that now, but 15 years ago, when you were this bright, creative kid who shared his interests and his sense of humor, I felt threatened. I convinced myself that there wasn't room for both of us in his heart. The conversation was surreal, hearing Victoria acknowledge dynamics I'd sensed but never been able to articulate. For years I'd wondered if I was imagining the subtle ways she'd excluded me from family life. Learning that her behavior had been deliberate was both validating and heartbreaking. I can't undo the damage I caused, Victoria said, but I wanted you to know that I see who you've become, and I understand why Robert believed in you. After she left, I sat in my office thinking about forgiveness and family, and the complicated ways people hurt each other out of their own pain. I wasn't ready to forget everything that had happened, but I found myself hoping that Victoria would find the peace she'd been searching for. The grand opening celebration that evening was everything I'd dreamed it would be. The warehouse spaces were filled with community members, city officials and business partners who had supported the project from the beginning. Margaret had organized everything perfectly, and the local press coverage was overwhelmingly positive. As I gave a brief speech about the building's transformation, I spotted several familiar faces in the crowd. Maya was there with her new boyfriend, beaming with pride at her friend's unexpected success. Mr. Henderson stood near the back, looking satisfied with how everything had turned out. Even some of Dad's old business associates had come, many of them admitting they'd been skeptical about my ability to carry on his work. But the moment that meant the most to me came when Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived in the affordable housing project Dad had completed years earlier, approached me after my speech. "Your father would be so proud," she said, squeezing my hand. "He always said buildings should serve people, not the other way around. You've honored that vision." Later that night, after the last guests had left and the cleanup was finished, I walked through the empty building one more time. The exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors looked exactly as Dad had sketched them in his preliminary designs. But more than the physical transformation, I was proud of the community we'd created, the small businesses we'd supported, and the connections we'd fostered between neighbors. On my desk the next morning, I found a newspaper clipping Margaret had left for me. It was a feature story about the warehouse project, with photos of the renovated spaces and quotes from several tenants about how the affordable rent was allowing them to pursue their entrepreneurial dreams. The headline read, "Developer's Daughter Continues Family Legacy of Community-Focused Growth." For the first time since Dad's death, I felt truly worthy of the inheritance he'd left me. Not just the financial assets, but the responsibility to continue his vision of development that strengthened communities rather than displacing them. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Janet Morrison from First National Bank, the same woman who had questioned my qualifications just months earlier. "Sarah, I wanted to congratulate you on the warehouse project," she said, her tone completely different from our first meeting. "We'd like to discuss financing for your next development. I understand you're looking at the old textile mill on Division Street." It was true, I'd been quietly investigating the possibility of converting another abandoned industrial building, this time into a mixed-use development with affordable housing, commercial space, and a community center. The project would be larger and more complex than anything I'd tackled before, but I felt ready for the challenge. "I'd be happy to set up a meeting," I told Janet. "I think you'll be excited about what we have planned." As I hung up the phone, I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped thinking of myself as someone pretending to be a developer. I had become a developer, with my own vision and my own projects to pursue. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. I'd visited his grave several times since the funeral, but this was the first time I'd come with good news to share. I told him about the warehouse project, about Victoria's apology, about the new development I was planning. I told him I finally understood why he'd trusted me with his life's work. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the letter he'd written, the one where he'd apologized for not being the father I deserved. But sitting there beside his grave, I realized he'd given me exactly what I needed. Not just financial security, but purpose, community, and the chance to build something meaningful with my own hands. The business had indeed consumed me, just as Victoria had predicted. But unlike her dire warning, I'd discovered that being consumed by work you love is entirely different from being destroyed by it. Dad had known that about me before I knew it about myself. 6 months later, I broke ground on the textile mill project. As I posed for photos with the ceremonial shovel, I saw Margaret taking pictures from the crowd. She caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up, the same gesture Dad used to make when I accomplished something that made him proud. The little girl who'd once felt displaced in her own family had grown into a woman who created spaces where others could belong. It was exactly the legacy Dad had hoped I would build. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.